That was quite an introduction. Not sure it was entirely justified, but okay. Well, thank you to the Aberdeen Business School for inviting me to do this lecture. I mean, having looked at a few previous ones on YouTube and looking at the audience that's gathered here, I'm just wondering how suitable I am actually to be doing this lecture. However, the world of academia does not come naturally to me. And growing up as somebody who was an undiagnosed dyslexic, it would be true to say that many of my teachers did not enjoy my version of participation in the education process. So that's kind of my starting point. What I'm going to discuss this evening is not based on academic training or theoretical business concepts. It's about what I've learned in practice in building several businesses, including many of the sandbanks that I've hit trying to do that. So what I'll talk about, I think, are the things that I see as the 4 key elements of entrepreneurship. And that's about taking a balanced approach to risk, about trying to have leadership that, sets a vision for a business and drives it forward, and about resilience, in the face of adversity and the ability to change position and to move when things change quickly. And in the current environment, that's very much the case currently. I just wanted to say that if this lecture doesn't go well, I was kind of arm wrestled into it by Keith Bender, Maggie McGinley, and George Yule. I'll point them out later if you want to complain to them. But what I'm going to try and cover, I think, is my view of building businesses, the leadership that's needed, and the risk management, and how to motivate people, particularly what I've learned in the last 20 years or so, in the context. And I would like to try and relate that to the context of where we find ourselves as an energy industry in the current environment with changing, a volatile political backdrop. Energy security is very current and at the forefront of everybody's thinking. The transition towards lower carbon energy sources, the associated drive with electrification. There are so many things happening in the energy industry, and trying to manage a business, particularly an international one that's growing quickly, is, I describe it, it's like wrestling with an octopus. There's so many things going on, you're really trying to wrestle things to the ground and make good decisions. I think it's fair to say, hoping that I can get this to work. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. I think it's fair to say I'm not your usual CEO. So I think I kind of stumbled into becoming CEO and was probably thoroughly unqualified for it the first time it happened. But I'm also unusual in the sense that I think business should be fun as well as, I believe if you work hard and you have fun doing it, you can inspire people to come and join you. So I think I'm probably slightly unusual in that regard. I would qualify what I'm going to talk about tonight in that I don't think it necessarily applies to every business. The businesses that I've been involved in building are very specifically built to sell. They are private equity backed with significant debt leverage. So they do have, I would say, idiosyncrasies that apply to that type of business that are not relevant to businesses that grow out of their own cash flow or that are publicly traded. They're very specific. They have a very specific set of challenges. And I think I'll also touch on my recent experience over the last few years in I7V and being on the other side of the table and being an investor, which has actually been really interesting for me because instead of me complaining about the PE guys, the guys that we are backing are complaining about us. So it does give you a very different lens on it. It's probably worth me just giving a bit of background to my early experiences. I was brought up in rural Aberdeenshire in the late 60s and early 70s. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm a proper tjuchter, as they would say up here. So my parents had a small shop and a post office, and my grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with as a kid, was a local cattle dealer. And I credit some of my business instincts, if you like, from those early experiences around what it means for customer service, what it means to get sales and to negotiate deals. I think it's fair to say my academic performance at school was at best poor. As I said earlier, I'm dyslexic, and it wasn't diagnosed until much later, and I had a whole spell at school where I had to have speech therapy. Some people would say I should have speech therapy now, but I think, I used to do things like I'd start writing on the right-hand side of the page and write to the left, and you could only read my work with a mirror, which is a great party trick, but it's not great for passing exams, or certainly didn't impress any of my teachers. So it's fair to say that I kind of built up a bit of resilience at school because, I was the kid that they asked to go to the back of the class and play with the plasticine because I was pretty disruptive, if truth be told. So I did, however, have an aptitude for technical subjects, particularly mechanical things. And interestingly, it kind of showed what the view of education was at the time. My guidance teacher wrote on my last report card, and this is a literal quote, "Douglas is lazy and will likely not achieve a great deal in life," which is hardly a ringing endorsement for a life in business, but that's literally what he said. So it was a thoroughly miserable experience, and I think has tainted my view, unfortunately, in this audience of academia since then. But it did build a measure of resilience, as I said, and even at that young age, I was interested in business. I was really interested in motorbikes. I did a lot of repairs. I would do repairs for other people and charge them what I thought was a modest amount for doing those things. And where the title for this lecture came from, the "On the Edge, Not in the Hedge," is actually what I used to have on my motorbike helmet when I was a teenager. But it's become kind of a mantra for me. It continues to describe my approach to life in general and business. And I think sometimes in a business context, when I use that phrase, it's misunderstood. People think that I'm advocating that you take unnecessary risks. And actually, it's the exact opposite of that. It's pushing yourself and pushing the business as hard as you can without going over the edge. So it's actually taking measured risk, not ridiculous risks that you don't understand. Anyhow, I left school at 16 and did a mechanical apprenticeship here in Aberdeen and spent 15 years working for a number of engineering contractors, both on and offshore. And at the time, the oil industry was kind of in its infancy and was very short of people. So basically, if you put your hand up to do something, you got to do it. It was almost as cavalier as that. And I got supervisory roles in my early 20s that I probably should never have had. I ran a fabrication and welding shop here in Aberdeen in my early 20s. And, I think it's fair to say this picture is actually me offshore on the Occidental Claymore platform in 1989, the year after Piper. And I was AOC's project manager and had 200 people offshore and had 200 back-to-backs. And I was 27 years old at that point. I think in the current world, that would be a very unlikely scenario. I actually was on Claymore the week before the Piper incident occurred, and that, as a consequence, has affected my view of safety and has stayed with me. It's an experience that you would never forget, and I think there are many people in Aberdeen who were literally scarred by that experience. But, while I advocate taking significant risk in business and stretching a business in its financial resources and straining its cash flow to the limits, I've never taken risks with people's safety. And I think it's a consequence of coming up through the tools, becoming a supervisor, and experiencing some of the things that I experienced in the early days of the oil industry. Anyway, after that initial 15 years, I was offered a position with KBR, which back then was part of the Halliburton Group. And in my 10 years with KBR Halliburton, I did a variety of roles, as was in my bio. Particularly, I spent 5 years in Colombia and Venezuela. And although I found working for a large corporation pretty frustrating, very slow decision taking, a lot of internal politics. It did actually give me a lot of experience in contract management, commercials, general business governance. And also it exposed me to different cultures. And I think honed my leadership skills in how to motivate people from different cultures who had a different tolerance for risk. And I think that experience was a foundation block in my later success when I became a CEO. I had had that exposure to working in different parts of the world. And interestingly, although Halliburton gave me many positive experiences, it was also where I witnessed some of the poorest leadership behaviors I've ever seen, where people made decisions that were about their career and their progress and not about the company, and certainly not about the team who worked for them. And I took that as a very solid lesson as how not to behave. And although I made it to a reasonably senior level in Halliburton, I never really fitted the mold of what they thought a senior manager should be. And when I was leaving Latin America to come back here, my boss was what I would call a Texan good old boy called Bob Verrett. And he used to call me the renegade. He said, "Doug, you're such a renegade. You've made us a lot of money, but you're never going to get to the top of this organization," which was quite interesting, that you could be successful and yet viewed as being difficult. And none of my colleagues would view me as difficult. It was an interesting experience. And to be fair, Halliburton's been around for 100 years and is still thriving, so they must be doing something right. So, and as I say, it gave me exposure to different cultures, and that really helped when we were trying to expand PSL internationally in our mecca and now Aurora. So when I came back to Aberdeen in 2001, with Bob Verrett's advice ringing in my ears, I had already decided that I was going to leave Halliburton Company because I just didn't fit in. And I met a guy at the time, his name's Maurice McBride, and he described himself as looking after the bank's basket cases. And what he meant by that was that in the late 90s, in the oil and gas boom of the late 90s, many service companies were bought by private equity, particularly here in Aberdeen, and had serious debt leverage put into them over a period of time. And when the downturn came in 98 and there onwards, a lot of those businesses really struggled. They lacked the profitability and the cash generation to pay their debt and to pay their interest payments. So a lot of them were in deep trouble by the time that I was coming back to Aberdeen after quite a number of years away. And Maurice persuaded me, rightly or wrongly, I was thinking of leaving Halliburton anyway, but he persuaded me to join what was then PSL, which I think, when I look back on it now, is, at the time, did I really understand what I was taking on? That's what I meant by the first slide. No, I didn't. I kind of stumbled into this. I thought I knew how to run a business, but actually I had been a regional manager for a massive corporation. And when you need finance in a big corporation, you phone Treasury and say, "Send 30 million, I've got a new job." In industry backed by private equity, somehow or other you have to persuade somebody to loan you that money, and that's a lot harder. So I think joining PSL probably admirably describes my approach to risk, because it had 90 million of financial instruments of one sort or another and 3 million of EBITDA. So I'm assuming a lot of the audience know what EBITDA is, but it's earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization. So it's the free cash that a business generates. So that kind of leverage is obviously ludicrous, because the normal sort of leverage is 2.5 to 3 times, maybe in the current environment, maybe as much as 5 times. But it was fair to say it was teetering on the edge. I mean, you could certainly see the hedge at that point. There was no question about that. So, and to say the first few months were brutally stressful was probably an underestimate. But in the first year, to keep the business afloat, I sold its Norwegian arm, I restructured the company, reduced its overhead, but still it was just overburdened, and it went into receivership in March 2003. And at that point, I was thinking, well, perhaps leaving a 10-year job wasn't quite as smart a decision as I had thought. But I'd agreed to take the business through the receivership process, and I had no intention of trying to buy the business at that point. But interestingly, about a week into the receivership process, a senior guy from the Bank of Scotland approached me and he said, listen, Doug, you've straightened this business out. We can actually see that it's making money. It was just so heavily indebted that it was never going to recover. They said, we would like to introduce you to another private equity company and we'll provide some debt to that to allow you to buy it, which, as I said, was not in my plans at all at that time. And they introduced me to Lime Rock Partners, which is a relationship that went on for 15 years, all through PSL and Intermec. I have huge admiration for those guys, and they really were very supportive. So in the space of 4 weeks during receivership, we ended up buying the business. And I guess at that time, again, kind of shows my sort of how I view risk. So I borrowed money to buy shares in the business. I signed warranties that were probably in excess of my complete net worth at the time. And I think, was that being foolish? No, I don't think it was, because I'd been in the business and my instinct told me that it was a good business. And it had a lot of really, really great people, some of whom actually are in the room tonight. And, I felt inside myself that if we owned the business and it wasn't a burden with all that debt, we could take it out and grow it. And my positive view of PSL was kind of affirmed by the fact that there were 30 companies interested in it when it was in receivership. The receiver eventually shortlisted 2, which was the management team led by me and Halliburton, which was the interaction during that period with my former Halliburton colleagues was interesting, but probably a story for another day. And as normal, as I'm sure most of the room will realize, normally an acquisition of a company is a lengthy and very structured process. You would typically do a market analysis, an assessment of the opportunities for the business. You would develop a strategy and a business plan, a financial model with all the sensitivities and costs and growth and profitability in there. That would be a classic business management way of assessing a business. But in receivership, you don't have that luxury. You have a very short period of time. I mean, obviously I had been working in the business, and Lime Rock knew that part of the market because they had other investments that were doing similar activities. And they were prepared to back it. So, it was obviously there was significant risk in there, but the backdrop also was, this was in 2003, the industry activity levels were beginning to recover after the downturn that started in '98. And new territories, new international markets in the Caspian, West Africa, and Brazil as examples, and the opportunity to grow into those was very evident. And our strategy was pretty simple. We were going to continue doing what it did in the UK. It had a lot of excess equipment because it was significantly smaller than it had been. And we were going to just expand internationally. And my experience of working overseas with KBR, I think, was an inherent part of being able to do that. And as we said in the introduction, in 4 years, we quadrupled the revenue. EBITDA was 17 million when we sold the business to Halliburton, which is, a pretty strong profit performance. We had expanded it geographically, Azerbaijan, Thailand, Norway, and into Algeria. We did 1 acquisition in the first year, which is very unusual when you come out of receivership. We bought Dolphin Well Services in Norway. But one of the biggest challenges was trying to get more debt into a business that had just come out of receivership. The bank had backed it initially, and that's where I think the other characteristics, a strong characteristic of an entrepreneur comes to the fore, is the ability to tell the story about what you're going to go do. So, you have to be able to articulate what's the opportunity, what are the funnel of opportunities, and how do you make a compelling case that you're actually going to be able to go out there and particularly as a service company, win contracts against much bigger competitors. And, being able to tell that story wasn't only important to the banks and the investor, it was also to the people you wanted to employ. And we, the whole of the leadership team in PSL was very good at telling that story. Every location we went to, we met with the staff, we talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. The staff really understood the challenges we had and the things we were trying to do. And that made them advocates for us as a business. They would talk to their friends and family positively, go to the pub on a Friday night and say what a great place it was to work. And that allowed us to recruit. And that communication and that consistency of story is so critical, I think, in building a business. And we went for 210 staff when we went into receivership to 1,100 in less than 4 years. And I think that was, the ability to do that was down to, that ability to tell a compelling story. So when the business was sold to Halliburton, excuse me, in 2007, Michael, who was my business partner, he sat in the middle there. I've had your mic isolated so you can't ask questions. He's been my business partner for 23 years. He reckons he would have got a shorter sentence for murder. So we stayed at PSL for 6 months or so. We had both worked for Halliburton previously and had no desire to be part of that big corporate world again. So at the end of 2007, we left. And sadly, PSL lost a lot of good people in the following 2 years. And what that taught me about acquisitions and the things to be avoided was that if you've got a clear plan for integration and you can articulate what you're going to do and what you're going to change, I've found that most people dislike change. But if you can be clear about what it is you want them to do, they'll go with it. They'll actually, come along on the journey with you. But it requires clear and frequent communication. And Halliburton simply didn't do that. And as a consequence, they lost the commitment of a lot of the people. So Michael and I took a couple of months off, and then in March 2008, we started Intermec. And that was initially literally above my garage in Newmarket, which, was an inauspicious start, I suppose. I mean, I remember describing what we were going to try and do with Intermec before we even had a name for it. We were at a Simmons cocktail party or something here in Aberdeen, and there was a lot of corporate finance guys there. And I was describing what we were going to go and do and the kind of services we were going to combine. And they all said, well, nobody does that combination of services. Why would you do that? And I said, well, that's precisely why you would do it. So I think that shows that the difference between how I think entrepreneurs think and maybe business management professionals think. People who start businesses see things differently, I think. They see opportunities, gaps in the market, discontinuities. They see the ability to combine things to have a different offering from what's in the market at the time. So, Intermec grew to be a very significant business. And I think the reason that occurred was that we, had a very clear view of what we were going to do. And in the following 10 years, we did 17 acquisitions, all of them small owner-managed businesses. That's a lot of M&A in a relatively short period of time. But our strategy was simple. We acquired small businesses where, in a part of the market where there was a dominant player. So an example would have been Sparrows here in Aberdeen, where 90% of the offshore cranes market. We bought their smaller competitor. They didn't see us coming. We combined that with other services, a lower overhead, a more responsive, more service-focused mentality. And we took business off the big guys, and eventually including off Halliburton. So, I think that approach and being very clear about what we were trying to build helped us be successful and take business off the larger players. I think what also accelerated the growth at Intermec was during PSL, we had developed a network of business partners and advisors at lots of different places around the world. And that made internationalizing Intermec much more straightforward. And having the right partners in some of these territories is absolutely critical. So by way of example, we had a Chinese partner, Qingdao Pacific, who were great. They really understood the Chinese market and helped us in there. Baku Oilfield Services in Azerbaijan, Sonils in Angola. Making those relationships and getting a deal agreed with those guys was never easy. But the upside was you were inside the tent. They understood the culture. They knew how to get things done in those countries. And that really helped us grow the business. But it wasn't all plain sailing. So this is where I want to talk about resilience and the ability to pivot and to take new risks. One, to survive, and then to grow again. So when we started the journey in March 2008, oil was $147 a barrel, and there wasn't a whiff of a banking crisis. By October of that year, oil was at $40 a barrel, and Lehman Brothers had gone bust, and the world was in meltdown. Now, generally, I'm a believer in a no-blame culture, but I have to say, Michael is CFO. The fact that he didn't spot a global financial crisis coming and didn't have it in our funding plans. And then he went on to kind of reinforce that in 2015 when he didn't notice the biggest oil and gas downturn we'd ever seen. So, in all seriousness, that was it derailed our complete plan. That year, we had been planning to raise more equity and more debt to grow the business, and that just all evaporated when the financial crisis occurred. And, we then had to completely change our plans, slow down the rate of growth, and I think it was 2013 before we could even get conventional debt into the business. And to say that 2008 to 13 was stressful, well, I had hair before we started that, so it really was pretty difficult. But we did actually manage by, being very careful about our costs and growing organically. We still managed to grow the business. And I think that demonstrates real resilience. And I think, again, that's an entrepreneurial trait that's essential. You have to be able to take the blows when they come and to think about doing things differently. So, and as I mentioned a minute ago, then later on in the development of Enermec, we saw the sharpest oil and gas downturn that there had been in decades at the end of 2014. And from 2014 to the middle of 2015, the oil price plummeted from $110 a barrel to below 60. And at that point, we had been preparing to bring a new investor in to replace Lime Rock and help us grow the business to an even greater scale. And we had three offers, I forget now, First Reserve, Goldman Sachs, a number of, well-known players. And they just evaporated in the space of 3 months in early 15. And again, we were, left with our plans completely dismantled through nothing that we'd done ourselves. And I think to sort of compound all of that, Bank of Scotland, which was our bank at the time, then decided to put its whole oil and gas portfolio into what they called high risk, which meant no lending, almost weekly supervision with the banks. Michael had here before that started. So, we're just, it was really, really tough. But I think the robustness of our business showed in the fact that in less than a year, we were out of high risk, and they actually loaned us more money. And they said at the time that had never occurred before. And I think that was because we had a great team of people who were really focused on running the business as prudently as they could and positioning it to grow. And that, we went from there, we put more money in ourselves, Lime Rock put more money in, we did an acquisition in Australia, electrical business, that then took us into the LNG market, into infrastructure. We did a whole number of tunnelling projects under the city of Sydney. We did some rail projects. And, to come out of high risk and to put more money in, that's definitely on the edge, I would say. And this little graphic here, there's probably nobody in the room old enough to remember what a Weeble was, but when I was a kid, There used to be these toys that had rounded bottoms on them. And if you gave them a good smack, they would fall over, and then they would immediately stand up again. And for me, that's what resilience is about. You have to be able to get up and get on with it, even though it feels awful, and it's unexpected, and it was nothing to do with you. And the markets that we work in energy are unpredictable, they are volatile, and sometimes you have to be able to respond to that. And then, in Intermec, in the following 3 years, we added 40% of growth to the company. We went from 250 million to 400 million of revenue and 44 million of EBITDA. Considering where we had been just 3 years earlier, it was a spectacular turnaround, but it was about the people. There's no business that doesn't. You just have to have the right people, and you have to help them drive the business forward. And I think that's what we did. And I think investing more money at that time, as I say, obviously it was a significant risk, but it demonstrated that we were able to pivot to other markets and to continue growing. And I just put this slide in because Dilbert's my management guru, and I just love this slide about risk because, you can analyze things to death, but if your intuition tells you that it's the right direction to go, and you've got enough data to follow that intuition, then that's what you should do. And after the sale of Intermec to Carlyle, which was in December 2018, I had actually intended only to stay on for 6 months. But my successor, sadly, his wife became very ill, and Carlyle asked me to step back in to be CEO, which I agreed to, and then did, I think, another year. I actually finished in March 2020, and the day I finished was the first day of the first COVID lockdown in the UK. So I flew back from Paris, thought I would go to House Road, which was our headquarters, say cheerio to everybody. It was, the tumbleweeds were blowing through. There was one security guy. So it was just a really, really bizarre experience. And I then went 11 weeks at home, having been on the road 180 to 200 days a year, building Intermec. It was quite an interesting, all of my family were at home at that time, and me being at home made for an interesting period. But, none of them are buried under the patio, so we got through it. And actually at that point, the pandemic was making life difficult for everybody, obviously, but it was particularly difficult to create a new business in that environment. And Michael and I had decided to create a small investment fund. And really what we were hoping to do with that was to help early stage businesses. Because oftentimes an early stage business will be able to get funding from family, from friends, sometimes from angel investors, and they'll kind of bootstrap their way through the first year or so. But actually, when you get to the stage where you're looking for £250,000 or £1 million, it's really hard to find that level of investment, particularly here in Scotland. And I'm not absolutely sure why that is, but it definitely is. So we thought we can play in that space. We can also bring, as well as funding, we can bring our experience. We've built a couple of businesses, we've got a good network, we have probably other high net worths that we can persuade to invest alongside us. So that's what we went and did. And this slide shows you the I7V structures. The two businesses at the top are Michael's FIC and our family investment company. And we've got sort of 4 actively managed businesses in there. So Aurora is one of them, it's the largest one. The others, we're just shareholders. We provide a bit of advice, but we're really in a sort of non-executive role in those. So since 2021, we've made 9 investments, one of which we've already exited. Aurora, which is the largest one, we started in June of 2022. And before, or as we were leaving Intermec, Michael might have a different version of this, but we had both decided we were going to build a business that would help the oil and gas transition, in terms of taking people from oil and gas and technologies from oil and gas into renewables. So that really was where Aurora came from. And, we've built that business reasonably swiftly by a number of acquisitions. We've done 6 small acquisitions, most very similar to the Enermex story. And we've already grown these businesses significantly by injecting capital into them. And as a result, we've built a footprint, particularly here in the north of Scotland. And this was, I think, really important to us, to Michael and I particularly, that we wanted the people here to benefit from the transition, because it's a huge opportunity. I know there's quite a lot of negativity at the moment about the renewables business and the speed at which oil and gas is turning down, but it is a huge opportunity. And I think, we felt that having businesses in rural Scotland would be a contribution to that. But we have also built an international footprint, as was said in the introduction, across the US, the UK, and Australia. And all of that was built initially with our own capital, so no external equity. But I have to say that on that journey, SNIB, the Scottish National Investment Bank, has been fantastic. They provided a debt package for us quite early on, and more recently they have injected 10 million equity for 20% of the company. And all of that support has been really worthwhile for us. On top of our own capital, it's allowed us to continue this growth. And these are the services that we provide. And this is genuinely about taking people for oil and gas and technologies for oil and gas into other industries. And we have real cases, where we're using techniques that we used in oil and gas, in pumped hydro, in wind, using digital techniques that were commonplace in the oil and gas industry and bringing them into the wind industry. And in terms of the scale of the business now, it's around about 1,000 people. It fluctuates because it is quite seasonal, so 125 million revenue. But I think the key thing is it's growing at 30 to 35% compound per annum. And that is because I think we have a clear view of what we're trying to do, and we can articulate it. And again, we're getting people to come and join us. We've got a great team in Aurora, and they're coming to join us because they believe in the story. They want to be, they genuinely want to be part of that transition. And I think that is a hugely valuable thing. So this timeline just kind of covers what we've done in the last 4 years. I would say it's been a pretty busy 4 years in terms of both acquisitions and raising funding and all of that. But I think, we've shown tangible benefits in terms of taking people for oil and gas and transitioning them across to the wind industry. And as part of that, we built a state-of-the-art training centre in Inverness. The video running behind me is just a snapshot of what it does. But I think we had great support in this from Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Highlands Council, Skills Development Scotland. And since the time the centre opened, we've trained over 1,000 people. So to me, and that's in GWO, ECITB, Errata courses, to me, that's real progress in the transition, because a lot of those folks were for oil and gas. And most recently, we just finished our first military to wind course. And some of those guys have actually got jobs in the wind industry. And again, to me, that's a tangible proof that the transition can actually be delivered in real jobs and people moving into those jobs. And we also have technician apprenticeships, we have graduate schemes, we have adult retraining. And I think from my perspective, given my history and how I got into the industry, that's absolutely key aspect of our business, is bringing new people in, because that's what's going to drive a transition. And I think if you look at the UK at the moment, we have almost 1 million people between 18 and 24 who are not in education, training, or employment. And that is a tragedy. And anything that we can do as a business to reduce that has got to be worthwhile. I guess in the same period that we've been building Aurora, excuse me, Technology is changing the world. I mean, I think on everybody's lips is what is AI going to do in terms of employment and in terms of how work gets done. And we in Aurora, we've been running some trials with a local Scottish AI company called Scott AI, and that's been around trialing things like optimizing maintenance with the OEMs, producing competency standards, utilizing that tool to be able to test technicians on their competency. But also, you know, we're trialing it for contract renewal to help us speed up our bid process. We have a project at the moment looking at how we do our project management processes, creating dashboards to take that data and make better management information to keep our clients better informed. And I think all of those things will be differentiators. So I suppose the other thing that I would say about entrepreneurship is always looking for what's the next opportunity. How can you get something that's going to improve your business and get it in there to improve efficiency? And whilst I think that there are threats in terms of what AI might do, there are huge opportunities as well. I was saying earlier out in the foyer, we were chatting about the political backdrop. And in my business career, I think the current environment is the most volatile I've ever seen. Changes of policy, both in the US and here in Europe, you know, are very difficult to deal with. By way of example, as a business, we were going to open an office in the northeast of the US to support offshore wind, and overnight those projects were cancelled. An executive order for the current Republican administration. You know, obviously we had to change our plans, but then a few months later they're challenged in court. Some of those jobs are back on. You know, how do you deal with that? How do you make a plan that's flexible enough to actually respond to those things? It's very, very difficult. And some of the changes have actually been beneficial. So I was chatting to somebody earlier about in the US, the tax changes for onshore wind have actually meant that PPAs are going up in value. Wind developers are actually doing more work, ironically, although I think the occupant of the White House would prefer that wasn't the case. It is because they're doing upgrades and repowers because they're making more money, ironically. So, you know, but it's that changing environment, and it's changing so quickly that it's very difficult to deal with as you're trying to build a business. And, you know, one of my colleagues who's actually in here today, he'll recognize this quote. He said to me many years ago, Doug, strategy is a direction of travel, not a destination. And those words have stuck with me through building these businesses, because if you're too rigid about what you're trying to do, you won't survive, because competitors come up with new ways of doing things, the market changes, you know, even things like we're so used to free trade being expanded around the world in the last 30 years, and suddenly we have tariffs. And for us, simple thing like importing parts from Denmark for our crane in the US became a major problem, you know, just overnight. So, you know, trying to be able to respond to all those things quickly requires you to have flexibility in your strategy. And, you know, also, as I said earlier, there are lots of new technologies. This is a technology that we've invested pretty heavily in to optimize floating offshore wind to make the installation and the actual operation much less costly. And, you know, it's a different type of risk, but again, instinctively and looking at the data, offshore floating wind is not going to mature unless the costs come down, because it's not competitive. And so investing in something like Squid, which is a mid-water buoy that makes connection of the cables and the moorings much simpler, it's based on prior art. It's very, you know, in the oil industry, we're all accustomed with this technology around FPSOs and turrets for floating production vessels. But for us, it's a £3 million investment. We've just built, this is the first one. It's going to be trialled off Ardersier in August. If it does what it says on the tin, it's been approved by ABS. If the trial goes well, I think there will be customers who will commit to using this technology And it will. We did a study for Ocean which showed that the reduction in cost was something like 25% of the total capex, which is really significant. So, I think, again, it's about trusting your instincts. But even with all of those challenges in terms of the changes, the unpredictability, the energy market, the politics, as I said earlier, the opportunity in the energy transition and the need for energy security is massive. If you look at the slide, it's up there behind me just now. It's behind me, so I have to just work out which left and right. That doesn't go well with the dyslexia either. The one on the top left-hand corner is the growth of onshore wind globally. The one on the right next to it is electrical services in the US. Just as an example, electrical service market in the US last year was $87 billion. And it's growing at 3 times the rate of GDP in the US. So if you enter that market, there's growth in just the volume of activity. You don't need a huge amount of analysis to see the opportunity. The one in the bottom left is global electricity demand over the next few years. And the one on the right is battery energy storage in the US, which is just going ballistic because battery technology is much more reliable, it's cheaper. Combined with solar, it's actually more cost effective and more efficient than wind. So, again, there's a dynamic that's changing there. So to exploit that, I think you need to have the right strategic priorities. I think, to run a business, as I said earlier, it's a direction of travel, not a destination. But you need to be clear about what you're trying to do, but build in flexibility to that. And inside Aurora, I think we revisit that strategy and look at it very thoroughly every 6 months, which might seem too frequent to people, but I think things are changing so quickly, that's what's needed. Stick with me, I'm nearly there. Everybody's looking a bit tired. I think we're providing services which there's a huge demand for, and I think growing the business to the scale that we want, we're going to be a tiny percentage of those markets. Michael and I used to have a slide that we used for the banks, and it was a picture of an elephant, which represented the oil and gas market. And we had a tiny pimple on its bum, which represented the percentage of that market that we actually had. And if you look at these markets, US, Europe, Australia, you don't need an awful lot of that market to grow a big business. And for us, I think to get to $500 million by 2031 is, I'm not saying it's a walk in the park, because it's not, but we'll get there because the opportunity exists. And I think we've got the right solutions and the right services to be able to exploit that. But I want to emphasize that, I talk about an entrepreneur's view. No business is built by a single individual. All of the businesses that I've been involved in and have led, it's been about having a great team. And, I think if you understand that to build a business, you need to get the people to come and join you, but to believe in what you're trying to do. You have to be able to articulate the story. Somebody said to me once, if you want people to follow you, they have to know where you're going. So you have to be able to explain, this is what we're going to go do, here's where we're going to go do it, this is how it's going to work. And I think you also have to work with people who are different from you. I mean, a number of my colleagues, these 2 little guys in the cartoon are actually sat up there, Michael and Phil Bentley. Phil was our technical director in PSL and in Intermec. And they were my technical and financial conscience, because if you let me make all the decisions, we would be 200 mile an hour doing everything that was out there. And I think you need people who, can advise you, can have a different perspective, have a different lens on the opportunity, and maybe, just slightly more cautious than I am. So I think, I've talked a lot about what I think the 4 elements of entrepreneurship are, about taking balanced risk, about the impact of good leadership and setting a vision and being able to drive towards it. I think also part of that is set and stretch objectives for you as a person and for the business. Because I believe firmly that if you set an objective that feels like it's out there, you may not get to it, but you'll get a lot further than you would if you just set an ordinary, objective that was easily achievable. So I think inside that people piece, you have to be able to try and engage people and inspire them. And a few weeks ago, I was up at Thurso Technical College, and there was a group of apprentices there. And they were having a tea break, and I was just chatting to them about my experience and, starting as an apprentice and whatever. And, just at the end of that conversation, I thought, this is really what we're trying to do here, is to get people inspired, join the workforce, get involved, try be part of a business, drive things forward. And I think, Phil and I used to go to Northfield Academy when we were at Innermech, and we used to talk about the different ways about getting into engineering. He's a chartered engineer with, professional bodies and all that sort of stuff, and I'm, jumped up Mickey fitter, I think was the expression. But, we engaged with the kids in third year at Northfield Academy, and they were interested in the different routes and understanding different ways of doing things. And I think at this point in the energy transition, we really need to get people fired up and to believe that there's a great future ahead of us, particularly here in Scotland. So I hope my presentation has come across as, I'm not against formal business management techniques. I couldn't be in this august company, but I think hopefully I've shown that there's a place to combine that analysis and those tools with instinct and drive to get things done and to get on and to move the ball forward. So I suppose in closing, what I would say is, sorry, I'll go back one here. If you're passionate about a business idea, and there's a few people in here I know that are just starting their own businesses, and your instinct tells you it's the right opportunity, then do everything you can to make it happen. Somebody said to me before, think big and act fast. And I don't think that only applies to business. I think if you're passionate about whatever it is, your sport, kiteboarding, rugby, whatever, if you're passionate about it, get in amongst it, get it done. And this is my favorite quote, which is George Bernard Shaw's The Unreasonable Man, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But again, when I use this in a business context, it's often taken, I think, in the wrong way. I'm not wanting to be unreasonable with the people who work for me. You can tell they're not. You're not supposed to laugh at this point. But I think this is about being unreasonable in your expectations of yourself. I get up every morning thinking, what am I going to do? It's going to move things forward. And I have an unreasonable expectation of myself and the goals that I'll achieve. And that, I think, becomes part of how a business runs. As the Americans say, it becomes, that's how things are around here. We're going to get shit done. We're going to get on and move the ball. So hopefully that was informative. And I think we're now going to go to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Bigger steps. Well, thank you very much, Doug. You can come over here and have a seat, get a glass of water. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Keith Bender. I'm a professor of economics, but I'm also the business school's director of external engagement and impact. And I just want to say it was a fascinating talk. You had so many quotes and things that I wrote down. Definitely on my next out of office, I'm going to say I'm out of office because I'm wrestling with an octopus. I really, really liked that. I appreciate that we're sort of pushing up against time, and I have a ton of questions, but we're going to dinner afterward. I can ask him those. So I would really like to open this up to the audience. I know there are lots of people here who know Doug, but I think even those who don't know Doug are inspired by the things he said. So we'll spend some time having a conversation. So we'll start with you. If you could go ahead and press the button that says mic on the things to your... Yeah. Great, thank you.
No, you mentioned the financial crash of 2008. I was actually working in Angola at that time, and I saw the pound. You did get $2. In the next trip, you got 1.5 to the pound. So I'm looking to start a business or looking for a role. Just now I'm 54. I've got a lot to give. That's it. And
I think. Well, if you know Graham, I mean, he's one of our sales guys, and he's a force of nature for sure. I mean, I think the financial crisis was, I think so few people actually saw it coming. I was being a little unkind to Michael that he didn't spot it. But, you know, I think it's part of that. So how do you respond? How do you make the best of those circumstances? And I think we'd really tried to, you know, cut our costs, you know, tried to make sure the business would survive, and, you know, subsequently had to put more money in to get it to grow again. But I don't think there is a recipe. I don't think there's an easy solution. But I mean, that downturn did a huge amount of damage, as did the oil and gas downturn in 2015. The number of jobs that were lost, you know, in the industry at that point was frightening, actually.
well, the 5 years that I did in Africa was quite damaging to me as well. But
I'm sure, yeah. Excuse me.
Thanks. Who else has a question? Yes, back in the back, Marek.
Oh, Mike, it says, sorry.
Right.
I was really interested to hear a couple of things in there. One about the neurodivergent piece, because I have recently found out I have ADHD and autism, and I'm pretty sure I'm dyslexic, which is why I was looking for an OC speaker, couldn't find it. So I really like that, the notion that different perspective is really, really important, because I think we're all trained to conform and be obedient and do what you're asked to do, and you're a brave person if you stick your head up and go, wait a minute, this could be different. And I think particularly, you know, when you look at the higher education sector just now, I work in professional services, so I'm not an academic, I deliver services. We're having to come up with new ideas and do things, and when you're in that business environment working as a business manager, it's completely different from having that entrepreneurial piece, as you say. But you've got to, within that context of a big business, there's so many things going on within the academic context, within higher education. It's lots of small little businesses going on, and now that I understand more how that works, this has to be entrepreneurial. There's so much entrepreneurialism required within that framework of a big business, and I think it's a wonderful environment where that is bouncing around already. And I don't know, Keith, if you've got a view on how that works from a management perspective, and you've got to have that entrepreneurial spirit, which is very different from how to manage a company, but that's got to live in this environment. It's really got to live in this environment. So I'd be interested to hear what your views on how you kind of survive that and get through it and how it blends in.
It's a really interesting topic, because neurodiversity has become a topic of much conversation over the last few years, and that's a great thing. And we're genuinely trying in Aurora to get diversity into the business in every form. But people who are neurally diverse, they do see the world through a different lens, and you know, quite a number of entrepreneurs have that kind of background, if you like. I think what's difficult sometimes is inside a very structured, bigger organization, a different way of thinking. It's hard for it to get to the surface. It's hard for it to break through. You know, I've been very fortunate in that, you know, I've had lots of what would now be called mentors, great people I've worked for over the years, who've actually allowed me to express myself and to think differently about things. And then, obviously, when you're building a business and you're funding it, you know, you have a bit more freedom to do things that might not be conventional. But in a big corporation, and as we get bigger, that'll be more of a challenge. I mean, it's how do you make the space for people who think differently? And I think the only way you can do that is to try and increase awareness. And inside Aurora, we've actually had a couple of sessions with the exec just about, how, you know, what does diversity actually mean? What are we trying to do here? As opposed to just having a policy that we pin up on the wall, what does that actually mean? You know, how are we going to move a ball forward and get people in who think differently? And it's not easy, but I think it's worth the effort because it gives you a completely different perspective and ideas that you might not otherwise become aware of, you know? So.
Great, thanks. Yes, question here.
So my name's Jasmine. I'm from Renewable Parts. You might know of our company. My question is, in terms of the UK market, I see obviously Aurora Energy has expanded a lot into the US market. Where do you see the money coming in the UK? Is it in wind? Is it in solar? Or is it in hydro, as you kind of mentioned in Aurora? Where's this kind of next money coming in from?
That's a great question, actually, because when we set out to build Aurora, we talked about it being 80% wind services. And we're not talking about that anymore because it's such a tough marketplace, particularly here in the UK. You know, the idea that people are going to transition directly from oil and gas into wind and there's going to be the right number of jobs is just a myth because the density of numbers of people that you require for wind farms is much lower. I actually think in the UK that, ironically, that solar and BESS, hydrogen and CCUS are all going to be not necessarily bigger markets than wind, but I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think hydrogen, you know, the economics have been challenged a lot, but, you know, there's progress is being made in deploying that technology, and I think there will be more work in that. You know, what I see in onshore wind is it's very much a commoditized market. It's the lowest number in the bottom right-hand corner of the spreadsheet, and nobody can make margin at that. And I just think that, you know, there's a lot of hyperbole about how good the onshore wind market is, and it's not actually accurate, I don't think. I think offshore floating wind, because of the scale of the resource, if we can get the economics right, and by that I mean, can we reduce the installation cost? Can we get the uptime up to where onshore wind is? That's a much more viable business, ironically, although everybody at the moment is challenging whether whether it can work or not. I personally believe it, because of the scale and the consistency of the resource, there is actually a business there. Now, a lot of that stuff's not going to be manufactured here, but the assembly of it, the maintenance of it, you know, the stuff where oil and gas has got prior art, so cables, moorings, all of that stuff, I think there's a huge opportunity, and I think it will come when the economics make sense. And that, you know, yes, a lot of it has been pushed to the right, and some projects have even been effectively cancelled because the developer has effectively given back their license. There are cases where if you look at the economics and the network connections there, it actually makes sense. So I think for us, that's where we see growth here in the UK, alongside things like, on a smaller scale, pumped hydro. I mean, the grid infrastructure is a huge opportunity, which I actually think a lot of Aberdeen firms are ignoring. I'm not really sure why, you know, because if you look at even the north of Scotland, 10 billion in the grid upgrade just in the next, 7 or 8 years, 30 billion across the rest of Scotland, 110 billion in the UK. That's a huge market. And I think we ignore that at our peril. And I think what we're trying to do is to be diverse enough. Part of what made Enermec a success was it had a number of different service lines and a number of different geographies. And that insulated it from all those ups and downs. And that's effectively what we're trying to do with Aurora. So.
Great, thanks. Question here.
Hi. My question is about, you talk about the importance of taking risks, but of course risks don't always go well. How do you know when it's appropriate to actually take these risks?
I mean, I had an interesting discussion about that the other night, actually with my family. And, where does instinct come over experience? Instinct is developed based on experience. So I think if you look at a risk and you think, well, I can see how this could go wrong. I can see how it might go badly. can I track whether it's headed in that direction? Because the key in business is not that things don't go wrong. They do frequently. But it's the ability to change course, to stop that activity and to move to something else. You know, to grasp a nettle and saying, I got this wrong, I'm going to do something else. And I think, you know, there are good tools for risk assessment, but in the end of the day, you need, what I like in the businesses that I've run is to get the people who are running the business and who are part of that service line around the table to talk about those risks, because their experience will inform you about whether you should take that or not. But the key is, if it goes wrong, stop quickly and correct and go on to do something else. But you can't build a business without taking risk. It's just not possible. So.
A question back up there.
Hello, sir. My name's Mohammed Ali. I'm a mechanical engineer, and I'm studying energy economics and finance in Aberdeen at the moment. I've worked in oil and gas for the last 10 years of my life, here and in the Middle East. My question is, given the changes in the North Sea energy sector, is Aberdeen specifically diversifying their engineering skills into the renewable energy? And I know you've mentioned that your company does that as well. And if so, are we doing it effectively enough to not lose our engineering prowess? And what candidates could potentially do to demonstrate that prowess going into the renewables? Like I've changed, sort of diversified my field just by the looks of it. So what guidance would you give? And do you think we're actually getting there, or what policy instruments could further strengthen that?
I mean, I don't think we're moving fast enough, and I don't think that we're making the best use of the skills and experience that we have in oil and gas. And I think there are political reasons for that. I think the EPL is punitive and is making oil and gas decline much faster than should be the case. But also there's a bit of reticence, I think, from some people in the oil and gas industry to get involved in renewables. There are skills, I think, here in Aberdeen that could be better utilised. But it also depends which part of the renewables market you're looking at. So if you look at things like hydrogen, as an example, carbon capture and storage, the skill sets, there's a 90% match. You know, so I think businesses here in Aberdeen, they need to kind of get their heads up and look a bit further afield, because CCUS is not going to happen up here at St Fergus in the near future. But if, you know, we opened an office in Teesside about a year ago, we're getting traction there. There's a power station being built that the carbon capture plant is right next door to it. It's a big investment. You know, the pipelines that are taking that carbon to the reservoirs, the well services, that's all oil and gas, you know, skills and technology that's being deployed there. So I think we do need to be think a bit more widely here and be a bit more proactive about getting into renewables, because otherwise people from elsewhere will come and take that opportunity from us.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so I think we'll go here and then we'll have to
Doug,
close that.
first of all, love the story, great story. And I know it's all factual. But my question is for you as an investor, right? The university here, it's got lots of intellect and lots of intellectual students as well. So given that an entrepreneurial student will come out of the business school and come up to see you and Mike and maybe Phil as well, how would you summarize your top 3 priorities before you would invest in that student?
I mean, that's an interesting question, because we are looking at what is effectively a university spin out from Durham and Newcastle University right now. And I think what we look for, it may sound a bit simplistic. First of all, culturally, we have to feel there's alignment with the team, that we like them. You know, what investor ever asked that? But for us, it's important. We have to see as a market for whatever that technology is. We have to believe that inside a reasonable time frame, it's going to get to commerciality. So what's a reasonable time frame? everything we're in, we've been in for longer and spent more on than we set out to do. And that probably means we're poor investors, but it also means that you have to have especially early stage stuff, you have to have a longer term horizon. I think the other thing that we look for is, does the team have if it's a single individual, who are you going to put around them? Because a business requires a broad set of skills. It needs financial guys, people with financial acumen. It needs people who can sell. No sales, guess what? No business. So for us, our criteria is, do we feel like we can work with these people? I think part of it is, do we feel like they'll listen to some of the advice we give, not necessarily all of it. And that's kind of been our selection criteria. But also, what's really key is, can you put a team around them that will allow them to progress from that kind of early stage to becoming a tangible commercial entity? And that's been quite challenging. We've got a number of investments in our portfolio, and being non-executive has been super challenging for me, because I'm, as you know, George, the shy retiring type. So, not intervening and actually just trying to give advice rather than saying, you must do X, has been really difficult. But yeah, that's our criteria. Whether they're the right criteria, I'm not sure, but those are our criteria. So.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. I know we could go on, I'm sure, probably for another hour, but we do have to be mindful of time. So let me just quickly sum up. I mean, thank you very much, Doug. Again, you've given a really powerful reflection and really sort of key insights about your own career, but I think, I know we have a number of students here today, but even older students like me, I think can really, have really learned a lot this evening. And I'm really mindful that the importance of the context of the northeast of Scotland. I know you've worked all over the world, but where you've come from has really kind of driven a lot of what you've done. And so thinking about that in terms of the northeast of Scotland is really important. And as you've indicated, and as we all know in this room, we are absolutely at that sharp end of that transition and the challenges and the opportunities that brings, that you've highlighted really well. And that's why it's really important to have events like this in this space, so that we can have these kinds of conversations, both the academic but also the very practical, and hopefully you found that of useful. I appreciate it. I'm keeping you from the rest of your evening, but I do need to acknowledge and just give a couple vote of thanks just very quickly. First, to Heather and John for their words of welcome. I also have to give great thanks to the great professional services team here in the business school, Thea Bailey, Steph Cook, and Nick Hindley, who was here earlier today. They put many hours of work in the background to make sure that this was a success. So thank you all very, very much for all of your hard work. Thank you. I want to thank the University's Development Trust for their help in this, as well as to the Sants family who gave the money for the Watt Hepburn Lecture. So thank them for their support. And of course, we have to thank our speaker, Doug. Thank you again very much.